And welcome to the show. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/podcast. Today, we welcome back Jon Appino. He's the founder of Contract Diagnostics. And today, we're going to talk about two case studies. The first, how group negotiations led to better contracts for interventional radiologists. And the second, a group of 4 successful surgeons negotiate better contracts, a case study. So, Jon, welcome back to the show. How are you?
Thank you, sir. I'm well. I appreciate you having me back. We love we love doing this stuff, and we love talking about it as well. So I'm excited to share some successes with you today.
So let's talk about the first one, how group negotiations led to better contracts for interventional radiologists. Tell us about this one.
So first, every story matters, and we feel we work at Contract Diagnostics a lot with individual physicians, whether you're a resident coming out of school or a physician transitioning from one job to the next, or somebody going from a private practice into retirement. We work with individual physicians a lot, but we're starting to work a lot more with group contracts. And I think there's a lot of reasons behind this we can dive into if you'd like. But yeah, a couple of case studies that we wrote about. And again, these are hyper successful when they're done right. So the first one is this group of interventional radiologists, and there was 3 of them. They'd been working with this organization for many years, very successful in terms of their production. They were earning above the 75th percentile, but they felt like the trade-off between the work and the compensation was still a mismatch. They've been wanting to hire somebody to help them out with call for quite some time. They had a retirement that was going to be looming in 3 years, and they figured they better get that done soon so they didn't get stuck with more call being Q2 coming up when their partner retired. So they gave us a call and we talked through everything with them. We looked at their current contract. We felt that there was some space as far as where they were currently being paid and the workload that they were doing and where we thought we could bring them, in addition to bring up other important things like how their malpractice insurance was paid and the new hire for a 4th interventional radiologist coming up and making that much more of a priority for the organization. So they engaged us and we engaged with the employer, and we had a great process that was a little bit longer than we expected and we wanted, but at the end of the day, they were very happy with the result.
All right. So give us a little bit of context in terms of the setting. How long were these interventional radiologists? How long were they previously employed with this employer? And what kind of employer was it? Was it a hospital? Was it an academic facility? Just give us a little context in terms of the setting where they worked.
Yeah, it was a private facility, and they've been together, this group, for about 8 or 9 years. And over that time, the 3 of them had been hyper successful in working with this organization to bring their interventional radiology division up and really, really make it something where it didn't really exist before. And the 3 of them kind of created and then grew it to a very successful practice. They all got along. They were, I think, friends outside of work. They were all on the same page with what they were looking for in a renegotiation. They also hadn't had a discussion or a negotiation with the employer for 4 years. And this is something we feel that physicians should have these conversations every year as far as how you're doing and your performance and how your compensation looks, but at least every other or every third year in terms of asking maybe more specific questions with what they could do for compensation, how it will change. We've seen lots of articles on inflation over the past 18 to 20 months. And we've seen a lot of data this year coming out with MGMA on how physicians, most of them did better this year, but they still haven't paced with inflation. And they haven't, in fact, if you go all the way back to 2019. So real wages, if you will, are going down. And so they engaged us because they hadn't had that conversation for 4 years. They felt like the amount of effort and work they were putting in was not congruent with the amount of compensation they were earning, even though they were paid a lot of money, earning well above the 75th percentile. So they engaged us, and we had a great conversation with the employer, and the back and forth can get sometimes a little bit sketchy, but at the end of the day, they were happy with the results.
So talk about the dynamics of a group situation or negotiating as a group versus negotiating individually. How does that change the dynamics?
We feel that, first off, in a lot of our physician contract reviews, we go over lots of other things outside of compensation, but we focus heavily on compensation. Obviously, if the physician's able to negotiate it, but also just that they understand it. When we hear back from some of our clients, in certain situations, we hear that they can't increase pay because they pay all physicians the same. And I'm sure a lot of physicians learning to this or listening to this podcast will say that's what they've been told. They set the conversion factor at $48 for each physician, and that's what they pay everybody. So if you ask for 49 or 50, even if you're a highly successful physician and you may quit, they're likely unable to do it because they pay the department the same. And maybe they review compensation every second or third year, but they pay all the physicians the same. So our take is maybe the group should go in and say we should revalue what our work is worth. And if you haven't had a discussion with the employer in quite some time, now is the time. And so having data, being empowered with what's fair and what's fair market, if you will, based on how the employer's describing it, we feel that physicians have a lot more negotiating capital when they come as a group, whether it's 3, whether it's 20 or 40, when they come to the employer as a group saying, we'd like to discuss certain aspects of our terms, whether it's, and again, it could be compensation, it could be other things like staffing, it could be resources, it could be simply things like time off or how they're structuring calls. So it could be a lot of other things, but we believe that the physicians have a lot more power when they're talking together as a group than just individually as a physician.
So talk about some of the specific outcomes that this particular negotiation yielded. You talk about that a little bit in the article.
Yeah, so we were able to increase the conversion factor slightly, but more so, and I think better for them, we were able to increase a profit share allocation that they had. So they were allocated a certain percent of profits based on part of the practice. We were able to increase that significantly. That was going to benefit them both near term and long term as the practice continued to grow. We were on record with bringing in a fourth physician. So they're going to bring in a fourth physician. Before we were finalizing everything, they actually had the job posted. They were going to share in a percent of profits for that fourth individual until they elected them to be part of the plan, which I believe was after a 3-year vesting period. And we changed a couple of things on call, and everything else for the most part remained the same. I do believe we changed how their malpractice was paid. So I think they were paying for their own. I think the organization was providing them a supplement for some of the malpractice insurance as well. So we were hoping it was going to take about 3 months. It ended up taking about 5.5, but I think the extra time was definitely worth it.
And when this group of physicians approached their employer about renegotiating some terms of their contract, how amenable or how flexible did you find the employer to be?
At first, not that much. Some employers are happy to take discussions and conversations with outside firms like contract diagnostics around their physician employees or even their contractors. This one was a little bit different, and I think they realized that they hadn't had to have this conversation for 3 or 4 years. Physicians hadn't pressed it, and I think they thought that they I hate to say get away with it, but I think they thought this was just the new norm, right? You hire good docs and you let them run, and you don't need to have these conversations unless they come to you. And these physicians hadn't come to them. And I think they realized that having a outside company like Contract Diagnostics come with data, I think they were maybe a little bit nervous on how the process was going to go. But again, we take these things knowing that everybody has the same goals. Usually the physicians want to stay there. The employers enjoy the physicians. We want to just find a happy, cohesive way to move forward with a little bit better terms that work for both parties. And at the end of the day, this employer understood and realized, and we were able to find terms that work for everybody.
So I'm sure this group had several options when it came to third-party negotiations. It could be local attorneys, it could be contract diagnostics, a national firm. So what made them choose you guys?
I don't know. I know that one thing that separates our firm from others is we have that compensation data. We have compensation experts here. We have people who have worked on the other side of the table. So many of the folks that have worked here have worked in-house for hospitals, and they've led compensation committees, they've led contracting for these groups, and they know how these individuals think. And I think when a physician sits down and thinks, who do I want doing this for me? I want somebody who knows what the other party is thinking. I want somebody who knows how they're going to process things, how they're going to come back and say, fair market value, we can't pay you more. They want someone who's able to counter that with appropriate discussions and arguments and data. And those are all things that we can do at Contract Diagnostics with our team.
All right. Let's talk about the second case study. A group of 4
Yes.
successful surgeons negotiate better contracts. So another group negotiation. Tell us what this one's about.
This one, I'm happy about all the group contracts that we've done, but this one was a smashing success. Four surgeons haven't had an increase in their conversion factor for, I want to say, 8 years. And they're working at a small, somewhat rural hospital. They got along well with the CEO. And again, they just hadn't had a change in 8 years. They were successful. The four was producing as many as 5.2 90th percentile physicians. So they were producing a lot. They were earning a lot, even though the conversion factor by any means was well below what it should be. So I don't know how they heard about us, but they gave us a call and they engaged us. We got everybody on the same page with where we thought we could go after we analyzed the situation and we realized how much work they were doing. We felt they were severely underpaid, although they were earning a lot of money at the end of the year. We reached out to the CEO and they're actually happy to work with us. They looked at us more as consultants because, again,
Mm.
as a small hospital, they didn't have the ability to pay some of the consultant fees that some of the larger competitors do as far as what is fair market and how much should we pay people. They didn't have a lot of the data sets. And so we were able to review with them. We were able to review their production and peg them to how successful they had been, which the hospital didn't know. They knew they were successful. They knew that they were doing a lot of cases, but they had no idea how successful they were compared to typical 75th percentile physician or a 90th percentile physician. We were able to bring up additional items such as call and trauma call. They were doing an outreach facility as well. So we brought up outside things other than compensation. But at the end of the day, what the conversion factor, and it was almost difficult to request the conversion factor that we felt was fair because it was so far from
Mm.
where they currently were. The delta to the hospital every year was going to be significant. And we went back and forth with the physicians on what number do we present, because this seems fair to everybody, but it seems like a big delta from where the hospital is, and it's really going to impact their bottom line at the end of this year and every year moving forward, even though it was fair. And so working with the physicians and again working with the facility as a partner, we were able to step up their conversion factor over 3 years to what everybody deemed fair market in 3 years. We got a significant bump in year one, in year two, and then in year three, we got to where we felt that it should be the whole time. We were also able to implement a quality bonus of $50,000, which was new for everybody there. Since it was the facility's first time doing this, we were able to guarantee it in year one since they'd never done it before. We wanted to make sure they had a trial year to capture the metrics and then make it at risk in year two.
So I'm hearing from both of these cases that negotiating as a group would likely yield better results than an individual physician negotiating alone. Is that a correct assumption?
I think it depends on the goals, but overall, I think that's true. I think it depends on the goals. I had a physician call me this week and said, "Jon, what's your success with these negotiation packages?" It was a single physician. And I told him, I said, it depends on what your goals are. If your goal is solely increasing compensation, if your goal is having a better call schedule, if your goal is simply understanding the terms better and making sure that lines up with what's considered normal and fair, if your goal is being able to leave in 2 years with no hassle, with no pain, with no financial outlay, I think it all depends on the goals. But for the most part, yes, when physicians come in as groups, they're much more likely to be heard and taken seriously.
Now, negotiating as a group, of course, physicians have to be on the same page. Do you encounter scenarios where the physicians within that group had different values, different goals in the negotiations? And if so, how did you negotiate that?
We have come across it. So far, the differences have not been too vast, too separate, and we've been able to kind of get people on the same page. Now, some people they want to be a 0.8 and some want to be a 1.0. Some physicians in a group are more vocal and others are just kind of there for the ride. So I think it depends on what type of group you're working with. Obviously, the group that we worked with that were pediatric hospitalists, much different than a group of all female OBs that we worked with, much different than a group of mixed surgeons that we've worked with. So I think it depends on the group you're working with. But yeah, we do see physicians fragmented a little bit, but for the most part, the ones that we've worked with have seemed to be on the same page.
So the decision between negotiating alone versus with a group, tell us the type of questions they should ask themselves in order to choose the right approach.
I think everyone should ask themselves, when was the last time my compensation was updated? Do I understand my compensation? Do I know where I produce and how I'm compensated? So if you are producing in the 75th percentile, are you being compensated at the 75th percentile for a group or for individual physician. And if not, I think a phone call to somebody would be a good idea, or at least looking at some numbers and some compensation data, which we have here as well. Now, for a group, I think if a group has failed in the past to get movement, I think calling an outside firm would be a good idea. If a group thinks that they won't be heard, we worked with groups who they simply hired us because they wanted to be heard. They felt like the neurosurgeons, the surgeons, the cardiologists, the anesthesiologists, they were the ones that the hospital was listening to and bending over backwards for and prioritizing. And their little group wasn't going to be heard unless they hire someone to speak for them. So that was one of the frames. So again, I think that whether you feel like you won't be heard if you have some requests, whether you feel like you're being underpaid based on what the market is because you've talked to other colleagues at other facilities or seen job postings and conversion rates are simply much higher at other competing facilities. I think all those situations should yield at least a look under the hood, whether that means you engage a firm and we do a full group negotiation for you with the facility. I'm not sure that's for everybody, but maybe it's just help putting together a pitch deck, something that we're able to do here. And so I think it varies based on the individual physicians and based on the group that you're talking about. But I think everybody is at some point worth digging into some questions and at least giving us a call and hopping on an inquiry call with us.
So these two case studies, obviously very successful outcomes. But how common are those outcomes? How common do you get successes like this in these typical scenarios?
Our group negotiation division is fairly new. We've worked with a handful of groups, and so far, every one of them has been hyper successful. Now, as far as hyper successful, I'm looking at the return on investment for our fee, as far as what the physicians had taken back. Because again, it's not just a one-time fee; it's a bump today, and next year, and the next year, and the next year. It's recurring income, if you will, on the physician's wage. I think the lowest we've had, I think it was a $12,000 bump per year was the lowest that we've ever had per physician for this group negotiation division. So at the end of the day, they're hyper profitable for the physicians to partake in. And although some might be $150,000 and some might be $9,000 as far as an annual bump, it's definitely worth their time to go through the process.
So I've talked to a lot of attorneys when it comes to contract negotiations, and one of the things that they bring up is that sometimes a local attorney would know some of the local nuances of the medical institutions involved versus a national company like yourself. So how do you respond to something like that?
Yeah, I agree. I think I would never say that somebody should not use a local attorney. I think local attorneys can be very beneficial if they're looking at making changes in contracts, if they're looking at you're having some of that local knowledge. A local attorney might be better in some ways than a national firm like ours. Compensation data is something that we have that local attorneys don't have access to. The competitive landscape, since all contracts are all we do hundreds and hundreds of contract reviews in a given month, thousands in a year. And because of that, we're able to keep up on trends much quicker than a local attorney that might do 5 or 10 or even 30 a year. And sometimes a combination approach is warranted and necessary as well. But I would never say that a local attorney wouldn't be a good option for a physician. We take a little bit different angle as far as education and compensation than a local attorney would. Might maybe going over the legal aspects and making red lines changes to the contract. But I'll never discourage any physician from looking locally and seeing if that's a good fit for them.
We're talking to Jon Appino, and we're talking about two case studies about group negotiations, and he is the founder of Contract Diagnostics. Jon, will end with some take-home messages that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience.
Oh, I think just that everybody should be engaged in their compensation, engaged in their production, engaged in the terms of their agreement. Whether you're looking at, how do you trade time for money? It's a very important equation. Even if you earn a lot of money, you should make sure that the equation is fair for what your time is worth. I think if you haven't had an update in many years to your compensation schedule, now is the time to dig in and see how you're paid and engage a conversation with us or with anybody on what fair would be for your particular story. Not just looking at doximetry data or Medscape data or even MGMA data, but having your particular story listened to and then a customized approach sent back to you as far as what's appropriate and reasonable. And I think everybody should be proactive in that, not reactive. And I talked to the physician who, after 7 or 8 years haven't had a raise, and we get them a great raise and they are so thrilled and happy. And I tell them that I'm sad. And I'm sad that they didn't call us 3 or 4 years ago, because I think everybody should keep an eye on this every second or third year. It's hyper important. It's how you trade time for money. And I think that everybody should keep an eye on that equation in a proactive way.
Jon, as always, thank you so much for sharing your perspective and insight. Thanks again for coming back on the show.
Thanks for having us, Kevin.